The killing of Sharif Osman Hadi in December 2025 wasn't just another political assassination. It was something more. It became a flashpoint. You could almost call it a violent stress test for Bangladesh's brand new and very fragile post-revolutionary order. So in this analysis, we're going to break down what happened, why he was such a powerful symbol, and what this all means for a country trying to find its footing. All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the killing itself. Then, we'll get into who the victim was and why he became such a symbol. After that, we'll deconstruct the unrest, look at the media's role, analyze what this all means for the country's transition, and finally, look at the consequences for the future. Okay, let's start at the beginning, the event itself. This is about how just one act of violence managed to light a fire across an entire nation. To really grasp the chaos that erupted after Hadi's death, you just have to read this message. It's from a reporter, Zaima Islam, who was literally trapped inside her office as it was being attacked. She wrote, "I can't breathe anymore. There's too much smoke. I am inside. You are killing me." It's just so visceral, and it really captures the human cost of the political violence that was about to sweep the country. So let's stick to the verified facts for a moment. The timeline here is incredibly tight. On December 12th, masked assailants shoot Sharif Osman Hadi in Dhaka. Just 3 days later, on the 15th, he's flown to Singapore for advanced medical care. But it's not enough. On December 18th, he dies. And the very next day, widespread violent protests explode across Bangladesh. That speed, that incredibly rapid jump from a targeted killing to nationwide unrest, that's really the key to understanding just how tense things already were. So why such a massive reaction? Well, it all comes down to who the victim was. To understand the man at the center of this storm, you have to realize Sharif Osman Hadi wasn't just another politician, he was a symbol. So who was he exactly? Sharif Osman Hadi was a key leader in what's called the July Revolution of 2024, the movement that actually ended Sheikh Hasina's long rule. He started a socio-cultural platform called Inkulab Muncho. And maybe most importantly, he was running as an independent candidate for a seat in Dhaka. He was positioning himself as a total alternative to the old guard. And this is why he mattered so much. He was a major voice in that youth-led uprising, but he wasn't a typical party boss. He had this unique ability to bring together both religious and secular activists, two groups that don't always see eye to eye. He was also a fierce critic of the old political establishment and what he saw as foreign meddling. So when he decided to run as an independent, well, that completely changed the political math ahead of the new elections. He was a real game changer. Okay, so let's look at the reaction. The violence that followed his death wasn't just random rioting or spontaneous anger. If you deconstruct what happened, you start to see a very clear and, frankly, very disturbing pattern. Look at the targets. They weren't random at all. They were chosen for what they represented. Major newspapers like the Daily Star and Pratham Alo were attacked because they were seen as being too friendly to the interim government, or worse, having a pro-India bias. Then you have Indian diplomatic sites being targeted, a clear message against foreign influence. Even a cultural center, Chayanot, was hit, which felt like an attack on secular Bengali identity itself. And then the home of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the country's founder, was targeted. That's a powerful rejection of the entire political dynasty that came before. So, what does all this tell us? It points to something really fundamental, a massive breakdown in public trust. Protesters were going after institutions they felt had failed the ideals of the 2024 uprising. It's like all these abstract political complaints suddenly turned into very concrete, very real acts of violence. And of course, this leads us right into the battle over information. Because when something like this happens, a vacuum is created. And in that vacuum, suspicion wasn't just a feeling. It was weaponized. Now, this is where we have to be really, really careful to separate unsubstantiated allegations from confirmed facts. The rumors started flying almost immediately. The attackers fled to India. India was somehow involved in the whole thing. But what do we actually know? We know protesters targeted Indian diplomatic missions, and we know India suspended some of its visa services, citing security concerns. That huge gap between the rumors and the reality, that's what created such an explosive atmosphere. And you really can't overstate how serious this was on a geopolitical level. Just listen to this quote from a report by an Indian parliamentary committee. They said, India faces its greatest strategic challenge in Bangladesh since the Liberation War of 1971. I mean, let that sink in. Comparing this moment to the 1971 war that created Bangladesh, that tells you everything you need to know about the strategic stakes at play. So with all that context, we can now get to the core of our analysis. Has this transition been ruptured? What is the actual structural impact of all this on Bangladesh's political future?
And this is the first big question we have to ask. Is this just a turning point, or is it a complete rupture? Is this a crisis that Bangladesh's fragile political transition can handle, or has the entire path forward just been shattered?
The next question is about the movement itself. Hadi was a unifying figure, right? With him gone, there's a huge vacuum. So does his death risk turning this reformist uprising into something else? Into just a bunch of competing factions, leading to leaderless, chaotic instability? And finally, what about the state's response? On one hand, they deployed the army. On the other, they were publicly calling for calm. So what does that tell us? What do these mixed signals say about how resilient the government's institutions really are, and whether they can actually manage this crisis? All right, that brings us to our final section, the consequences. Let's look at the likely fallout from all of this, both in the short and medium term. What comes next? We can really break down the consequences into three main areas. First, politically, the upcoming elections are now under a cloud of doubt about their legitimacy, and there's a real risk the opposition movement could just splinter. Second, socially, there's a danger that street violence and intimidating the press just become normal. And third, regionally, diplomatic relationships, especially with India, are incredibly strained, and you start to see politics get securitized, where every issue is viewed through a lens of national security. The bottom line here is that the situation is incredibly complex, and it's still evolving. With elections scheduled for February, this full crisis has cast a massive shadow over the path to democracy. Frankly, it's impossible to predict what will happen next.
And that really leaves us with one last big question. When you kill a movement symbol, what happens next? Does the dream of reform die with them? Or does it find a new, maybe even more dangerous life of its own? The answer to that question is what will ultimately shape the future of Bangladesh.